Hello and welcome to the Meaning Project podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Dan, and it's always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share a little bit of mental health and meaning in your day. This morning, some really cool things going on at the home offices of the Meaning Project podcast and Dr. Dan. Therefore, I'm drinking out of my late morning coffee mug. It's just some really pretty colors here, I thought. So kind of nice. For those of you watching the YouTube video, if you're listening to the podcast, sorry you can't see that, but you can take a look at the late morning coffee mug, as well as this very comfortable Active Meaning Project podcast t-shirt I'm wearing. I think I'm wearing the active one today because you know what, after this, on a day like today, good idea to get out and get a nice run or bike in. But before I do that, wanted to share some things with you on the idea of mental health and meaning. If you follow me on social media, you know a few weeks ago I attended the Purpose Summit locally here at the University of Notre Dame. I really assumed it was going to be a more local event between Indiana and Michigan. It was sponsored by a group called Purpose Point out of, I believe, the Detroit area in Michigan, and Leopard Components, a pretty big manufacturing facility here in north central Indiana, and actually globally, worldwide. So this conference, like I said, if you follow me on social media, you know I attended. If you're not following me on social media, please take a moment and hop on over to either probably the Facebook page would be the best one to go. That's where I share a lot about where I'm speaking and what's going on and what kind of conferences I'm attending. But this particular conference was really outside my norm. As a therapist, I think I've shared with you before, we have to engage in 20 hours of continuing education every year. Much of my continuing education has been in the field of mental health and meaning, logotherapy, Dr. Frankel. Lately, in the past few years, it's been more focused on the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator and achieving master practitioner certification there. So this was a little out of the norm in the past decade, but it was well worth it. And for any of you, quite honestly, I say this jokingly, but in some ways seriously, for any of you that have a job and you're a leader in that job, I would encourage you to attend next year. Next year, it is sometime in May. The link will be on the show notes. But this conference had a lot to do with leadership and finding purpose, or as we call it here, meaning, which is similar but different. We'll get into that. Purpose at work. And for those of you that just said, well, I'm not a leader, I would challenge you, if you're listening to this podcast and you have a job, there's a good chance you are a leader in your work environment. One of the things I've always known from the great author Seth Godin, and especially from this conference, was the reminder that any one of us can be a leader in our work environments, in our home environments, in our community. It just takes, we don't have to ask for permission. We can simply lead. And hopefully today I'll give you some ideas how to do that. Today's podcast might be a little bit different because really I'm just going to take the notebook that Purpose Point gave me and go through it and pull out some of my highlights to share with you. First, at the Purpose Summit, I did take a little note in the side of the book here. A lot of buzzwords in the manufacturing industry, in the work industry. I don't know. Of the 500 people who attended this year at the University of Notre Dame, I believe they said there were about 200 companies recommended, which for a conference of that size in its second year was really quite good. For a conference representing that great need of purpose at work and encouraging people to find purpose at work, I was a little sad. It seemed a little underrepresented. Ideally, next year, so this year I attended, we were hosted in one of the sides of the stadium, beautiful ballroom there, conference room. The goal next year is to have even more businesses represented and ideally host it in the hockey arena. Now, if you know me, you know that's a personal joy of mine, and I would love to be able to sit in that hockey arena and listen, or if the cards work out right, maybe even to be able to present on that stage. So once again, I would really highly encourage you, if you are a leader in your workplace, to consider attending next year. And if you're not a leader in your workplace, then maybe we should talk about what you need to do to get there. So my notes from the Purpose Summit. First of all, some of the buzzwords that I heard: purpose, purpose-driven, a lot of talk about culture. Culture seems to be one of the big words in work today. Companies are realizing how important that is, first of all, to attract employees, which everybody seems to have a problem doing right now, but also to retain them. We've talked about on the podcast about inclusion and diversity. They throw out great words like, check this out: authentic, compassion, trauma, empathy, mental health, happy. Words that I feel privileged to use on a daily basis, but that we know aren't always considered in the workforce. So of these 200 companies that were represented, they are trying to do that. What else do we have here? Innovation, that's what I'm going to talk about here shortly. That was a big one that went around. Of course, post-COVID, going back to normal process journey, simplicity became a big one, as well as listen and listening sessions. So these are some of the buzzwords that these companies were trying to talk about, to discuss. Some companies had great success in bringing these ideas into their companies, and others were there to learn. So some of my personal goals that I put down before going to this summit, for me, looking at that buzzword, simplifying. I know lately, post-COVID, I feel drawn in many different directions, and fortunately, I'm having opportunities to prune back a little bit and refocus into some more speaking areas and into my private practice, and go, rather than being pulled in many different directions. We know there's a great need out there. I know there's a great need out there, and I want to be able to help as many people as possible, and that's, as we've talked about on the podcast, that's where this comes in, sharing with you here on the podcast, but also getting out more into public speaking. So those were my goals, and I believe I wrote here, hey, I'm just going to see how the summit might guide this. Day one started late in the afternoon. Just kind of checking in, meeting some people. We met the leaders of Purpose Point, Mr. Kurt David and Davin Salvano, great individuals that I got a chance to chat with. One of the keynote speakers the first afternoon or evening was Mr. Jason Lippert, President and CEO of Lippert Components. And the Leopard Story is a fascinating one I've been interested in for about a year now, as I talked to them last year on several occasions. They've really done an interesting job bringing about leadership and some of these more, what used to be called soft skills, into their workplace. So when Mr. Lippert comes up and says some of these things, I trust some of what he does have to say, because he lives it in his organization. And this was some really good research. So Peter Druckert is a business writer from maybe a few decades ago. And one of the things Mr. Druckert always said is, if culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? Culture is far more important than strategy in keeping a business going, according to him. Mr. Lippert Jason asked, then why do most businesses not have resources directed at it? Right? Many businesses today have multiple vice presidents or C-suite executives in finance and strategy and things like that. But very few, in my experience, and I'm sure in your experience as well, have a chief culture officer, or as Lippert has, a director, a vice president of leadership and culture. And that was really an interesting statement. One of the things he states is there's a Harvard study in the past decade that indicates 88% of people feel terrible about their work. They feel deeply disengaged, like their work doesn't care about them, and therefore they don't care about their work. There was another statistic later on that indicated 20%, only 20% of people feel engaged in their work in most national polls. So a large majority of us, depending on where we work or how we work, feel highly dissatisfied, disconnected, disengaged with our work. And if you're feeling that, you're not alone. However, if you are feeling that, become a leader. Lead in ways where you can have an impact, or work with your leaders to have an impact. And hopefully some of these ideas or some of these resources I share with you might guide you in that direction. One of the things he said through his speech, through his presentation, was really caught me and still sits with me today. I didn't even look at the notes, but he said, we're really new at this idea of bringing compassion, empathy, DEI. What I heard was humanity. We're very new. We're in the infant stages of bringing humanity to work, to manufacturing, to difficult jobs. And because we're so new at it, we're not good. But if we're not good, that leaves a lot of opportunity for innovation. And so that is my challenge to you as well as myself. If we're not good at it, we can bring innovation, we can bring meaning to our work and hopefully change that environment for the good. That was the message of this year's conference, was business as a force for good. And maybe you can't change the entire business, but you can certainly change that aspect around you. One of the next speakers, Mr. Matt Breitfelder, talked about, we're not really new, we're not really good at this. There's a lot of unknowns in bringing humanity to the workforce, and we can bring more innovation. He says that purpose is not an instant download, but it's a process and a journey. And too many companies not really jumping into that whole idea of a process or a journey, but really wanting an instant fix. And one of the instant fixes that came about for those of you in leadership positions or close to leadership is the idea of starting with one person to impact culture, to impact the idea of leadership. That this is not an HR job, an HR function. I know personally through a lot of the HR people that I work with, but many of you out there know as well, boy, the HR function is taxed these days. And that if you are serious about culture and leadership and bringing humanity to the workforce, bringing meaning and purpose to your workplace, that maybe you need to bring a person in. Maybe you need to bring in a consultant like myself, or maybe you need to hire for that position. Maybe the company you work for, if you're looking to move somewhere, that's what you look for. Do you have a culture champion? Do you have a C-level executive focusing on culture, leadership, people, and not just a human resources person? Mr. Richard Sheridan, the CEO of Menlo Innovations, I believe he was still going on that night or the next morning. Nah, he might have been the next morning. He was the next morning. He was the long day on Wednesday. He is a tech guy, well-spoken, right? When we think of most tech people are somewhat introverted, but he got out there and really put on a good presentation, talking about running the experiment, that idea of innovating in your workplace. If you have an idea, sometimes taking an experimental approach and seeing how it works can be incredibly helpful. He says you don't have to change the world. You can just change your world. And he gives an example. I believe it was a major insurance company, Mass Mutual. He did some consulting with. He's talking about 100,000 square foot cubicle room. I wrote cubicle farm in my notes, where I believe this was customer service people that had to take calls, right? And if any of you have ever worked in customer service, there's often a very structured way to do it. But this company adopted one of Mr. Sheridan's ideas on running the experiment. And they said, anybody running an experiment, here is a helium balloon to put on your cubicle to let us know you're going to try something new for this day, this week, this month, so people can ask about it. And when the speaker visited, he saw tons and tons of people innovating in their position, taking leadership, taking opportunity to make attempts to change the situation for the better for the company as well as for their clients. And that was one of the messages I've heard for the past several decades, but as well, even in my work as a manager and leader early on in my career, allowing people the autonomy to make decisions, to innovate, to try, allows them, well, as we know in logotherapy, right, that opportunity to be creative is an opportunity to discover meaning. As human beings, when we have to run the same regimented 8 to 10 hour schedule every day of our lives, Monday through Friday and sometimes Saturday, it's a recipe for burnout. And so cultivate that run the experiment idea. Look for opportunities to try things different. Ask about it, innovate, and if you're a leader there, allow your people the opportunity to innovate. Sheridan talked a lot about being a storyteller, and he was just one more advocate for companies to add capacity for culture. Not to put one more duty on human resources or already taxed leaders, but that more companies need to look to hire industrial organizational psychologists, people like myself who go out and do a variety of consulting in that area. And to look to, I know Lippert has their Dr. Amber Selking is a sports and performance psychologist. And she is amazing in that position. She just put out a great book, I believe it's called Winning the Mental Game, that I started reading and I would definitely recommend. The next speaker, this guy was so much fun, right? So we got to hang out with the CEO of WD-40, right? So this company, I'm sure you know, specializes in one thing, making little cans of oil. But their message was so much different, right? Their motto was more about creating memories with those things to fix things and to have an emotional impact. And I didn't write it down. I'm really annoyed about that. I think I should have picked up Mr. Ridge's book. However, in our little our app for the conference, I did get to exchange with him a little bit. And I even issued him a bit of a challenge, right? Because he says part of his motto is our purpose in life is to help people be happy. And if you've listened to this podcast for long, you know I probably don't agree with that, because it's not about being happy, as Dr. Frankl says. It's not about being happy, it's about finding meaning. And when we find meaning, happiness, success, all those other things will follow. As we say, they will ensue from our discovery of meaning. So I offer that to him. Have yet to hear back from him, so don't think I'm that important. He says, pleasure, this was an interesting quote. Pleasure in the job puts perfection in the work. When we enjoy our job, we do it better. Pleasure in the job puts perfection in the work. That was not Gary Ridge, CEO of WD-40, that said that. That was the Greek philosopher Aristotle, well over 2,000 years ago. Pleasure in the job puts perfection in the work. So we've been looking at that for 2,000 years. And now companies here in the US and worldwide are really learning how important that is. Mr. Ridge also talked about, this was a great analogy, growing culture. If you've ever taken high school biology, chemistry, this is bad. I don't remember which one this was, but you grew cultures. It surely is biology, right? Because you grew viruses or bacteria in a little petri dish with culture. And what did it take to do that? It took daily watching, daily attention, and removing any toxins that might harm the environment. And so he compared growing corporate culture to growing, culturing bacteria in a petri dish. You gotta watch it daily and remove toxins. And sometimes I know as a leader, we find that really hard to do. He was a dynamic speaker, had a lot of great ideas to say, love your people. He was really connected with his people and really sought to bring meaning to it. He'll be stepping down from WD-40 this year, and somebody else will taking over. I'm sure you might see him on the speaking circuit, or if you come to the Purpose, I confuse those two, the Purpose Summit next year, maybe you'll get the chance to meet Mr. Ridge. I do want to go back. I can't believe I forgot the very first speaker. I must have skipped a page or didn't take notes. Because, I forgot the book in another part of the office. The very first speaker of the day, the evening, was Mr. Joe Calavera. I'm going to mess that up. I'll put him in the show notes, right? But he was a dynamic speaker, had a lot of very positive things to say, right? Very good opening speaker. And I committed to myself. I said, you know what? I'm just going to share my appreciation with that guy. So through the app that we use something called the Huva conference app. I reached out to him that night and said, hey, really appreciate your speech, appreciate what you did for us, thank you. And we kind of chatted back and forth, and at that point I said, you know what, I'm gonna make sure I'd at least have lunch with this guy or sit down and talk with him. So that's a funny story for the long day Wednesday, when I did completely somewhat embarrassed myself, but really not, because Joe did say, you know what, we he says, always he said, invite yourself through interruption, invitation through interruption. So for dinner that night, as everybody's kind of socializing, having a drink, preparing for dinner, there was an opportunity to tour the stadium and go touch the Notre Dame Fighting Irish, play like a champion sign. And I know he went down to do that. I've done that before. I've ran Notre Dame a few times, so I didn't have to worry about that. But I said, I'm going to make sure I grab a seat at his table. And I did. And I think I grabbed the last vacant seat because there were a lot of people that were either friends of Joe's or clamored up with him to sit with him. And so me in inviting myself through interruption was a really cool opportunity to meet this keynote, what I consider to be a powerful keynote speaker, learn more about him, pick up his book, but then also to socialize with the people at the table. And for me, okay, so I am a bit of an extrovert, but even after 2 days of conference, that was a little bit exhausting, but so meaningful, connecting with other people who I still connected with today, that I would actually have to look at my LinkedIn information to remember who it was. But I know I met Craig from Lionheart, the CEO of Lionheart Manufacturing, and Mike from a very cool Jeep and pickup truck product store up in northern Michigan. So that was really cool. People that, hopefully I will get to see again, or maybe called on to do consulting or business with. So when you go to conferences, if you go to conferences, even if you're an introvert, sometimes it's important to put yourself out there as a bit of an extrovert, or to use the energy, right? We know that if you're an introvert, it takes energy to act as if an extrovert. But in doing that, there's some meaningful discoveries that can be made. So that was, oh my goodness. Now we're still into breakout sessions of day one. Mr. Nick Craig of the Core Leadership Institute talked about, I love this. This is right out of logotherapy, right? Purpose is the unique gift that you bring to the world, right? How often do we talk in logotherapy that you are a special and unique individual with a task to do, right? What I call a God-given task, a task that you are to complete to benefit your family, your community, humanity. And here this discussion of purpose goes right along with that. He did talk about, this is right out of the pages of Patrick Lencioni, whose books are sitting right behind me. His book, Death by Meaning, says, meetings have to fulfill a purpose. How many of us, my goodness, I hear this all the time, how many of us are sitting in meetings day in and day out, day after day after day, that have no purpose, or just people speaking? And so if you are struggling in meetings, or if your group is struggling in meetings, please pick up Lencioni's book, Lencioni, Death by Meaning. I know I picked it up probably some 20 or 25 years ago when I was a director or manager, and it was groundbreaking for how I held meetings, and still how I do them today. This was Mr. Nick Craig asked this really question. This was kind of the group participation portion where he put a lot of people on the spot, and this was one where usually, I'm happy to be put on the spot. If you remember a couple podcasts ago when I got to go meet Jordan Peterson, like, yes, I'm going to sit in that audience, and you bet your bottom dollar I'm going to ask him a question. And I did, and really had a nice brief interaction with him. But this was a situation where I'm like, man, I do not want to be put on the spot, because his question was, and this is a good one for us all to ask, how does my purpose connect to my organization's purpose? How does my purpose connect to my organization's purpose? And of course, my first instinct was to totally dismiss this and be like, well, I'm a one-man show, so I don't have an organization, and therefore I have no purpose, which is silly to think of, and really just a lazy excuse to try to avoid the topic. And so I really kind of took a few minutes to try to dive in there, and some of the questions I never answered it. I think I asked myself more questions about how do I manifest and define my purpose as a one-man organization. Do I consider growing to a multi-person organization? As we've talked about, if you hop on the Patreon site, do I bring on people to help with podcast production, to make the podcast bigger, to do different things as a one-man psychotherapist and consultant? The other side of that is, do I go back to a group practice I once ran? And that was kind of scary for me, because part of that question was, how do I create a fair, equitable, and profitable group practice? Because for those of you practitioners out there, one of my biggest professional pet peeves is those therapists who hire other therapists and then take anywhere from 50 to 60% of their earnings to give them a room or to do billing or marketing. I've always felt being in private practice is certainly not rocket surgery. The work that we do is far more important than the business side of it. It has to be treated as a business, but surely nobody should have 50 or 60% of their earnings taken from them. Oh, pardon me. That completely snuck up on me. I'm sorry. I did not have time to hit the pause button. I apologize for your ears. And for me, one of the big questions that came from Mr. Craig was, how do I help more people discover their meaning, their purpose in life? Part of that was, what is this Meaning Project podcast? What is the Meaning Project for me? Does that continue to grow in different ways outside of my one-on-one or couples to me clinical practice in my office or virtually? We had a nice little panel with some people from the sponsor organizations, very nice organizational consultant, industrial organizational psychologist. Some good things that came out of that. One of the ideas, that's what I wrote down. For those of you who are still shaking your head going, well, Dr. Dan, I'm not sure why I'm listening to this because I'm not a leader. You can be a leader. And one of the ways they suggested this is really cool. Leadership development. It can start with simply starting up a book club with other people you work with. Whether that is my favorite, Man's Search for Meaning, or Doctor in the Soul, or I definitely recommend Patrick Lencioni's The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, The Advantage. Jocko Willink is a great one. Dave Ramsey are great. I love me some Seth Godin and Linchpin. You can start up a little leadership organization in your workplace by simply doing a book club. You don't even have to meet live anymore. We can do book clubs virtually. So this is going to sound a little harsh. There's no excuse. I feel like if you are listening to this podcast, I'm willing to assume most people aren't going to pick up episode 59, 60, whichever one this is, and be like, hey, I just want to hear what Dr. Dan has to say about the Purpose Summit. No, you've been here for a while. If you've been listening for a while, if you've been watching for a while, you know more about this idea of meaning and purpose than most people do. It's always been my goal to help more people know these ideas. And now I'm going to put that on you a little bit. If you listen to this, you have some knowledge that people around you could benefit from. So ask a few people to read Man's Search for Meaning with you. Ask a few people to pick up some leadership or spiritual book and have a book club. See what kind of ideas exchange. See how your time with me in this podcast informs what you have to share with people. I would be really interested. I would love for you to share how that might work out. So at the very least, this is my challenge to you today. Take a book like Man's Search for Me. You know what? Take this podcast and share it with 5 or 10 people and be like, hey, I'm going to listen to this episode and maybe we talk about it, right? I think of one person I know in particular. I know, David, you're a driver out there. You're one of my big fans I'm sorry, not me, the podcast big fans on Facebook. Thank you for listening. And if I remember correctly, you're out there driving a lot of your day, not a lot of opportunity to interact with others. But what a cool way to do that, to share this with your peers and be like, hey, how can we become better leaders, better, more meaningful employees in our workplace and transfer that into our community? That was one of the very cool things that Leopard talked about. Their people put in 1,000, 10,000, a lot of hours a year in community service projects. And that might sound dreadful in some ways, like, oh, I have to do more work. But they actually loved it. They really reported back. It brought them together and made them a better part of their community. It sounded really amazing. So maybe that's an opportunity as well. All right, so let's start a book club. There you go. We had one of the vice presidents of a very big nurse staffing firm, so that was pretty amazing to hear the idea of her experience through COVID. But before we got to her, sorry, I was looking at the wrong name. My favorite speaker, Mr. Chester Elton. I am currently reading his book, Anxiety at Work. and using it for a few speeches. I've actually picked up the Anxiety at Work podcast. For some odd reason, Chester's got just this interesting voice that reminds me of a comedian I heard a long time ago. He was a powerful speaker. He wrote a book about the carrot principle, right? So using motivation and rewards at work. But he wrote a book about carrots, or the carrot principle. So he comes out dressed in blue jeans, orange shoes, and a vibrant orange shirt, throwing out stuffed carrots at people that answer questions for him. So that just kind of sets the stage. But he and his partner, wow, some solid research. And the book Anxiety at Work really presents some amazing case studies, some amazing research about it. That was a lot of what I took out of there. It was a good research-oriented repetition of a lot of the messages and a lot of buzzwords that companies need to attend to their people's mental health with empathy, with care, if they want to keep businesses going in our current marketplace. If you take anything away from today's podcast, I definitely recommend checking out Anxiety at Work and the Anxiety at Work podcast. And also, you get on Amazon, you look at Anxiety at Work, you can see their other works as well. And they are just really good authors and great podcast. So that was wrapping up day 2. That was a powerful and long day. Day 3 was the nice vice president of the nurse staffing firm, who had some good statistics. Something I forgot to look up that actually I underlined in here was Google's Project Aristotle, that talks a bit about leadership and team culture. She says leadership is a trait that is culminated within us. What a great answer to that question. Is leadership learned or born? Are leaders born, or do they learn? She says it's culminated. We're all born with a little bit of leadership. We're all born with ideas. My favorite artist, Hugh MacLeod, says, we are all given a box of crayons early on in life. And some of us go on to learn how to use them, and some of us forget. And so that goes with the idea of leadership, is that we can grow that. You can grow that simply by picking up a book, or continuing to listen to a podcast like this, or picking up Anxiety at Work podcast, all kinds of opportunities. She says, team culture is a set of behavior. Oh, this was awesome. So I highlighted it. Team culture is a set of behaviors that is either rewarded or punished. More important than impact is how safe a team feels, right? A team has to feel safe to share ideas. One of the things I teach in my consulting, in my business consulting, my organizational consulting, is people aren't going to challenge ideas if they don't feel safe. And if people are not challenging ideas, you have what's known as groupthink. Everybody goes in the wrong direction. And if you've ever seen the animal lemurs, it only takes one to start jumping off a cliff before they all follow behind. And that's an example of people not dissenting, not feeling comfortable to disagree and have healthy and productive conflict. If you need healthy and productive conflict in your workplace, let me know. I love doing that stuff. We bring in the Myers-Briggs. We talk about conflict and personalities. I'm preparing one for a local business right now. Man, if you are afraid of conflict in your workplace, let me know. I love to help with that stuff because I enjoy cultivating healthy conflict. That's what I do every day for couples, for families, for organizations, for businesses. We should not be afraid of conflict. Conflict is what brings about alignment. It brings about compromise. It brings about connection. But when we fear it, we develop resentment and frustration and anger. That's why a lot of people leave organizations, companies, and sadly, sometimes even marriages, because those conflicts go unspoken. All right. Sorry, got off a little tangent there. We had a great speech by Sam T, who was a wonderful Sri Lankan-born businessman. Talked a little bit about some biblical principles, has this amazing business where he really does a lot of good helping people. And I'm sorry, I can't pronounce his last name because he's Sri Lankan and, well, I don't want to butcher it. So a lot of just really good information around those buzzwords. Not much else to share. For me, my to-dos afterwards, the gentleman by the name of Scott, I wanted to follow up with the Frankel quote with him. I believe that was another speaker I sent his way. checked in with Purpose Point on working with them, and challenged the CEO of WD-40 with that idea of, we're not here to make people happy, we're here to help them find meaning. So, sorry. Again, I warned you in the beginning that was going to be a different bit of a podcast. Just hashing through my notes. I didn't want to make it too formal and really write it out much for you. But if you have any questions, please feel free to get a hold of me. You can find out more about other conferences I'm going to or even speaking at danielafranz.com, DANIELAFRANZ.com. Hop on the Facebook page. That's where I show some of it. I think you've heard me say before, I am terrible at social media. I love podcasting. I love sharing ideas with you. I love interacting with people and helping them. I'm not good at the self-promoting part, the social media part. So if you are, please share, give some feedback on the podcast. Thumbs up or stars or whatever podcast app you use. Like it, leave us a positive comment or a negative comment. Or, honestly, if you have a negative comment, just send it to me directly. But I guess if you want to post it, you can. But please share this with others if you feel they'll benefit from it. Like I said, if you're interested in this pretty comfortable t-shirt I'm wearing, or the Meaning Project coffee mug, pint glasses, etc., check out our merch store at the bottom of the podcast notes. If you want to be a patron through the Patreon page, take a look at that. Most importantly, it's always a pleasure to share this with you. As you can tell, if you've been watching or listening for a while, I'm in a bit of an echo chamber here, right? These are my ideas. I bring Rabbi B on or Manya Chalinsky from the Boston Marathon bombing. I get to talk to other people sometimes, but I tell you what, I really appreciate your feedback. I've received a lot of really good, and that doesn't mean it's all positive, even constructive feedback. And that's a lot of what the Purpose Summit was about too, is giving and accepting constructive feedback. As a therapist, I give it a lot. I receive it a lot. I appreciate it from you. So thank you. Friends, family, followers, listeners, I appreciate you. I certainly do. And I appreciate the feedback you give me on this. So thank you. I hope you found it meaningful. I know I certainly did. I really hope I see you at the Purpose Summit 2023. I know I will be there, and I look forward to maybe getting to meet some of you for the first time there. All right. So again, thank you and take care.